You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Here we go, folks. Good evening. It is Monday evening after Thanksgiving weekend. Welcome to the show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio, and check out the Federation. There's a link for it over there. That is Russ's site. You're going to want to see what they do in addition to radio broadcasting. Also, come on over and watch the video simulcast on my YouTube channel. That's where I show you some pictures every now and then. You get to see my mug talking, but most importantly, you see the other Intrepids carrying on conversation in the live chat room going on right now during this show. Go over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Well, I hope everybody had a good weekend. I want to say thank you again to all the people that joined me yesterday morning, which is not broadcast on Odyssey Radio, but my Sunday morning live stream over on YouTube. That was a fun time. We had about 100 of you over there watching, and I appreciate that. We had a good live chat room going. And then, of course, Rainey always joins me on Sunday mornings. So that's always fun. It's fun for me. I hope it's fun for you, too. And today, I want to repeat a little something that we did yesterday, kind of impromptu, in the Sunday morning show. And for those of you here tonight that weren't there, and if you were there and you heard some of this, you get to hear it again. And you can join the chat room and maybe add your 2 cents worth on this. But I wanted to talk about something I have noticed is that, and this is in the political realm, I call it more current events, but it's so dripping overly so with politics, you can't but separate it out from politics. And that's the whole issue of the challenge that Donald Trump is making to the election. And it's based on a belief that there is fraud, and fraud on such a deep level that it will be like, I don't know, pulling teeth is probably a bad analogy, but it will be almost impossible to prove. But what he does have to try to prove is that there were anomalies. And I think that's what they're working on doing. Now, I will state this outright. While I would like for Donald Trump to win, and I would like him to be able to provide evidence and prove that there was the fraud that we believe took place, at the same time, I think it's unlikely he's going to be able to make that case. He can take it all the way to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, of course, needs certain criteria to be able to decide that. Now, let me also say at this point, those of you who are not Americans, those of you who are listening from Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France, England, Ireland, Scotland, all of my friends across the seas, this is an international show. I know you all know about what's going on over here, but don't liken it to like a weird, you look at like Venezuela, you look at like these other countries where there are coups and so on. I believe that there is a bloodless coup that's in the process of being made right now. And that is a disenfranchisement of the American people. Disenfranchisement. I think I said that right, if that's even a word. And I think that that's taking place on a voter level. And if you believe that there is no voter fraud, that nothing untoward happened behind the scenes in this election, you can pull this other leg of mine and it'll play jingle bells for you. Now, I did want to go through, because I think this is very interesting and worth repeating, that there are reasons why the 2020 presidential election is deeply puzzling, and why there are people who are questioning it. And the basis, I'm not going to make a case for Donald Trump's case. I'm going to make a case for why there is a question about it. And you will notice that the questioning the election or the accepting the election falls right along party lines. If you voted for Biden, there was no wrongdoing. If you voted for Trump, there was all kinds of wrongdoing. And in order to make Biden a plausible electable candidate. That's not even the way to say that. In order to have made him the projected winner of the election. Which, by the way, I'm going to state right now for you emphatically, if you have not gotten this already, Joe Biden is not the president-elect of the United States. He is the projected winner of the election by the media, not by any official capacity. And the reason you put question that happens every election. There's always a projected winner. But when they are so close, so razor close, and there's so many questions as to propriety, that you've got to firmly take him out of the president-elect category and put him in the projected to win category by the media, by the press, not by the official standards. And so if cranks are the only ones that find the tabulations of the votes strange, then you can put me down as a crank too. And here is the let's see if I can call this up for you, because I think this is something I posted on my profile the other day, and I think that it's important to take a look at this. So hang on here a second while I get to my stuff. What's it doing here? I'm looking for my profile on Facebook. I'm going to the home page, and this is where I've got this. You can take a look at this at your leisure if you'd like, or I'm going to go ahead and in here and read this for you so you know what I'm talking about. This is what I put up the other day. If I can actually get to my page. Am I somehow not able to get to my page? I'm getting there, I think, eventually. Right there. Everything's shifted around on here from what it used to be. So, okay. Let me find this for you. I know this is scintillating live radio, but here we go. Here's where I stand on the elections. Here's where I stand on the what would you call it? All the improprieties that are out there. And if you were here yesterday, you heard some of this, but now this is for the public radio show. And here's where I stand on the election challenges, and there's at least three these points articulate my positioning on it very well. And first, I've got to say out loud to anybody that you find the results of the 2020 presidential election odd is to invite derision. And you know where that derision comes? Anybody on the left. And you're derided, you're called a conspiracy theory, a hack, an idiot, a crank, a right-wing nut job, whatever it might be. But it draws the derision of anybody. I've said it, and I've said, look, I'll support Joe Biden if he becomes president. He'll be my president, even though I disagree with him on a political ideology. But I think that there were questions about the election. And I've had good people come in and take me to task and try to take me down and deride me because I believe there might have been impropriety. And here are the reasons why I think there was impropriety. Now, go through these. We're only going to spend the rest of this half of the show. And what we don't finish, we don't finish. Because I want to get on to the labyrinth of Egypt and take a look at that. And if not that, we're going to get into some of the things about the Magi. So you guys hang on here. I'm going to get through this, and I think this is important stuff. But we're going to get to some other stuff as well. And we're about 10 minutes into the show, 9 minutes into the show right now. So we've got a few minutes to make this case. So the first thing I want you to consider about why this election is being questioned by many people. First, consider some of these facts. President Trump received more votes in this election than any previous incumbent seeking re-election. Now, I've heard people explain that away as, well, the population's greater. But they don't say that when they say, Joe Biden got more votes than any presidential candidate ever. And you never hear them say, well, that's because our population has increased. Hasn't increased all that much in the last 4 years, or 8 years even, when Obama was reelected. So Trump got more votes than any previous incumbent president ever in the history of our nation. He got 11 million more votes than he got in 2016. And the third largest rise in support ever for an incumbent president. And by the way of comparison, President Obama was comfortably reelected in 2012 with 3.5 million fewer voters than he received in his first election in 2008. Trump received 11 million more than he did when he won in 2016. 95% of Republicans voted for him, and he did extraordinarily well with the rural male working white class working males. And he performed far better with many key demographic groups. Oh, and I have to say this as well. Obama won re-election with 64 million votes in 2012, Obama's second election. He won re-election with 3.5 million less than he'd gotten in his first election, but he still retained 64 million votes. Trump apparently lost his re-election with nearly 80 million votes. So nearly 16 million more votes than Obama got to get re-elected in 2012, 8 years ago, Trump lost. So he earned the highest share of all minority votes, Trump did, for a Republican since 1960. Trump grew his support among black votes by 50% over 2016. Nationally, Joe Biden's black support fell well below the 90% mark, the level below which Democratic presidential candidates have always lost the election. Those sound like anomalies? Maybe there's room for fudging in there. But let's go on. Trump increased his share of the national Hispanic vote to 35%. With 60% or less of the national Hispanic vote, it's arithmetically impossible for a Democratic presidential candidate to win Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. And the bellwether states swung further in Trump's direction than in his previous election in 2016. Florida, Ohio, and Iowa each defied America's media polls with huge wins for Trump. Now, since 1852, that's 170 years ago, only Richard Nixon lost the Electoral College after winning that trio of states. And that 1960 defeat to John F. Kennedy is still a subject of suspicion 60 years later. So Midwestern states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, always swing in the same direction as Ohio and Iowa, their regional peers. Ohio likewise swings with Florida. So current tallies show that outside of a few cities, the Rust Belt swung in Trump's direction. Yet Biden leads in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin because of an apparent avalanche of black votes in the city of Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee. So Biden's winning margin was derived almost entirely from such voters in these cities, as coincidentally, his black vote spiked only in exactly the locations that were necessary to secure his election. He did not receive comparable levels of support among comparable demographic groups in comparable states, which is highly unusual for the presidential victor. Now, by the way, if you're from outside the country and this stuff is kind of irrelevant to you and you're just listening because it's the show, I think this is really relevant in the category of this is what's happening in the United States right now. This is what's happened to the vote. This is the possible problems that we're facing over here. And it might be interesting to you on that level, because I'm going to tell you something. If the United States crumbles and falls, most of the world will crumble and fall too. Now, you may not like the sound of that if you live in a different country, but the United States pretty much holds things together. And if the United States is gone, you're going to see turmoil the world over. So, let's go on. We're told that Biden won more votes nationally than any presidential candidate in history. but he won a record low of 17% of counties. He only won 524 counties, as opposed to the 873 counties that Obama won in 2008, yet Biden somehow outdid Obama in total votes. That's an anomaly. Victorious presidential candidates, especially challengers, usually have down-ballot coattails. That means when you vote, you don't only have the president, you've got Senate, you've got House, you've got all these other things where people are running. And there's other elections on the ballot. And that's called down-ballot from the presidential candidate. So usually the victorious presidential candidates, especially challengers to the sitting incumbent, have down-ballot coattails. And Biden didn't. The Republicans held the Senate. So far, we still got the 2 special elections in Georgia in January that's going to tell the tale, and enjoyed a red wave in the House, the Republicans, where they gained a large number of seats while winning all 27 toss-up contests. Trump's party did not lose a single state legislature and actually made gains at the state level. Trump's party gained 11 new female senators and congressmen, representatives in this election. Another anomaly is found at the comparison between the polls and the non-polling metrics. The non-polling metrics include party registration trends, candidates' respective primary votes, candidate enthusiasm, social media followings, broadcast and digital media ratings, online searches, the number of especially small donors, and the number of individuals betting on each candidate. So despite poor recent performances, media and academic polls have an impressive 80% record predicting the winner during the modern era. But when the polls air, non-polling metrics do not. The latter have a 100% record. Every non-polling metric forecast Trump's reelection. For Trump to lose this election, the mainstream polls needed to all be correct, which hardly any of them were. Furthermore, for Trump to lose, not only did one or more of these metrics need to be correct, which they were not, they had to be wrong for the first time ever. But every single one had to be wrong. And at the very same time, an impossible outcome, but extremely unlikely nonetheless. So every single one of the external non-polling metrics had to be wrong for the first time ever in history. What does that tell you? So atypical voting patterns married with misses by polling and non-polling metrics should give observers pause for thought. Adding to the mystery is a cascade of information about the bizarre manner in which so many ballots were accumulated and counted. You ready for these? There's 9 of them. We went through these yesterday morning if you were here yesterday. This, amongst many other things we talked about, we brought this stuff up. And I want you to pay attention to this. The following election peculiarities also lack compelling explanations. When you've got everybody saying, well, there's no proof that there was fraud or anomaly. Well, here it is. This is what causes the questions to rise. Number 1, late on election night, with Trump comfortably ahead, many swing states stopped counting ballots. It just stopped in the middle of the night. In most cases, observers were removed from the counting facilities, and that's observers who were there to make sure it was being done correctly, and counting generally continued without the observers being present. Number 2, statistically abnormal vote counts were the new normal when counting resumed. They were unusually large in size. We're talking hundreds of thousands of votes once they resumed the counting with no observers, and had an unusually high 90% and above Biden to Trump ratio. That's an anomaly. Third thing, late arriving ballots were counted. That's illegal. Remember, We don't live in a capital D democracy. We live in a constitutionally limited representative republic. There are laws and regulations about voting. One of them is you have to be postmarked by a certain day. The other one is it has to be done timely if you're going to mail in votes. And it has to be proper. It has to follow procedure. But late arriving ballots were counted. In Pennsylvania, 23,000 absentee ballots have impossible postal return dates. And another 86,000 have such extraordinary return dates that they raise serious questions. So it's 86 and 23. What do you get? You get 89, 109, almost 110,000 votes have serious questions about their postal return dates. And now number 4, the failure to match signatures on mail-in ballots. The destruction of mail-in ballot envelopes, which must contain the signatures. They destroyed the envelopes that contain the matching signatures of mail-in ballots. Number 5, historically low absentee ballot rejection rates, despite the massive expansion of mail voting. Such is Biden's narrow margin that, as political analyst Robert Barnes observed, if the states simply imposed the same absentee ballot regulation or rejection rate as recent cycles have, Trump wins the election, hands down. So the rules were changed. 6, missing votes. In Delaware County, Pennsylvania, 50,000 votes held on 47 USB cards are missing. Just missing. 7, non-resident voters. Matt Brainerd's Voter Integrity Project estimated that 20,312 people who no longer met residency requirements cast ballots in Georgia. Biden's margin is 12,670 votes, but 20,000 didn't meet the residency requirements. Why are they counted? Number 8, serious chain of custody breakdowns, invalid residential addresses, record numbers of dead people voting, ballots in pristine condition without creases. That is, they'd not been mailed in the envelopes as required by law. You have to fold your ballot to put it in the envelope to mail it. There were, how many? I don't know, record numbers of ballots in pristine condition with no folds on them. That means they never were mailed. Where'd they come from? Number 9, statistical anomalies. In Georgia, Biden overtook Trump with 89% of the votes counted. For the next 53 batches of votes counted, Biden led Trump by the same exact 50.05 to 49.95% margin in every single batch of 53. And it's particularly perplexing that all the statistical anomalies and tabulation anomalies were in Biden's favor at the same percentage rates. So whether the cause was simple human error or nefarious activity or a combination, clearly something peculiar happened in this election. So if you think that only weirdos have legitimate concerns about these findings and claims, maybe the weirdness lies in the people that laugh at you because you are asking the question. So there you go, folks. That's all the time we have in the first half of this show. We're going to move on from politics and the election, and I want you to think about that stuff. Look into it. We're going to move on. We're going to talk about some other cool historical things when we get back. Sit tight.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're right back here on the Intrepid radio program, broadcasting on Odyssey Radio. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. And then you can come over to my YouTube channel. You can listen to the simulcast audio along with the visual in the video. And that video also has with it a live chat room going on right now. If you're not here now, get over here. Join the chat room. Join the conversation. Join the opinions being thrown out here. And at the same time, talk about other things. Join the other Intrepids at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, I want to get into, I always start that. I always say now. Now, let's hear it now. Here we are. We're back. We're now. Now, moving on now. So now, that's a way of speech that I've developed over the years, I guess, doing radio. But I want to look at a couple of other things. And one of them has to do with, I'm kind of debating. I got two things. I got the labyrinth in Egypt that I want to talk about. Herodotus wrote about it. It's a mystery of ancient Egypt, the great labyrinth. And I also want to talk about the Magi. And this whole thing about why did the Magi bring gold and frankincense and myrrh? Because it's Christmas time is coming up. Who was Jesus' biological father? Who was Jesus' dad? Was it Joseph? Was it God? Some have said rather flippantly, I think, a Roman soldier. Who was Jesus' dad? And I've got kind of a... Here's a question for you. How were babies made in Jesus' time? And maybe this is all tying into the questioning the birth of Jesus, the miraculous birth of Jesus. So I let's go here first, and maybe tomorrow we'll go into this whole thing about the labyrinth in Egypt, which is a great historical mystery. But here's a question that's asked. Who was Jesus' biological father? And this is an examination, a look at Matthew and Luke and the nativity stories that are presented there. And if you ever saw the Peanuts special, the Charlie Brown specials that started airing, in 1966 or something like that on television, and you watched it every year as a kid, depending on how old you are. And I think they still air it now. And Linus stands up and says to Charlie Brown, the meaning of it, lo, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared, and so on. You remember that. This is Matthew and Luke. And was Joseph Jesus' biological father, do you think? If not, who was Jesus' biological father? Remember, Joseph is his dad. He's the carpenter. He raises him. And you've got that side of the story, but was he actually Jesus' father? So the Annunciation or the announcement stories in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke recount that Jesus was conceived without the participation of a human male, that God moved and God impregnated Mary, and that she was going to bear the Messiah, the chosen one, the kinsman redeemer to the Jewish people. And the Gospels of Matthew and Luke recount this, but that they say there was no participation of a human male. And ancient views on the biology of conception based on the Aristotelian theory differed from our modern understanding of genetics and biology. For Jesus to have been considered fully human by our modern standards and not by a semi-divine or a special being, he would have needed complete human DNA. While Mary would have supplied the X chromosome, who supplied the essential Y chromosome? Was it a miracle of God, or was it Joseph? Now, this is the question you have to ask. Now, of course, step outside the box for a second and look in. If you are a person of faith, it's God. God who created the universe from nothingness. The universe fell from his fingertips. Does he have the ability to create human DNA? Sure he does, because he created it in the first place. If you are outside that faith box, it becomes a question of science. Did Jesus... I'm not pitting science against faith here, but it becomes kind of that, doesn't it? It's got to be a human that provided the DNA, or it's got to be a real God that did this. Now, there was a guy named Andrew Lincoln of the University of Gloucestershire that tackles these questions in his article, How Babies Were Made in Jesus' Time. And we're going to, if we have time, we'll get to that a little later and take some pointers from that article and talk about that. But starting with the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke, the two Gospels in the New Testament, if you don't know the Bible, they're one of the two of the four Gospels that are canonized in the New Testament. He examines what early Christians have thought about conception in general, and explains how views about this subject have changed over time. Who was Jesus' biological father? As modern thinkers, we might wonder how the product of a virginal conception could truly be fully human, since the Y chromosome didn't come from a human father. So it's explained that this issue would not have been troubling to an ancient audience or to the writers of the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke. According to Andrew Lincoln in his book, their understanding of conception, shaped by a patriarchal culture, would have been some variation of the dominant Aristotelian theory, Aristotle's theory, on this view. The male semen provides the formative principles for life. The female menstrual blood supplies the matter for the fetus, and the womb and the medium for the semen's nurture. And the man's seed transmits his logos, or his rational cause, and pneuma, the vital heat or animating spirit, for which the woman's body is the receptacle. And in this way, the male functions as the active, efficient cause of reproduction, and the female functions as the provider of the matter to which the male seed gives definition. So in short, the bodily substance necessary for a human fetus comes from the mother, while the life force originates with the father. That's the ancient understanding. That would have been the context of the nativity story. So those who heard the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke would have considered Jesus to be fully human, since his mother supplied all of his bodily substance. But you have to clarify something here. In terms of ancient biology, even without a human father, Jesus would have been seen as fully human. His mother, Mary, provided his human substance, and in this case, God, through the agency of the divine Spirit, supplied the animating principle instead of a human father. So according to the New Testament, was Joseph Jesus' biological father or just his adoptive father? The Annunciation stories in Matthew and Luke claim that Jesus was conceived without a human father. But later in the Gospel of Luke, Joseph is listed as Jesus' parent and his father. That's in Luke 2:27, 33, 48, and 422. So indeed, through Joseph's lineage, Jesus is shown to have descended from King David. That's Luke 3:23 through 38. And do these accounts contradict the Annunciation stories? Or are they showing the importance that the biblical writers placed on adoption, because that's what God did. God adopts us into his family, so to speak. So the traditional way of receiving or reconciling these seemingly incongruous accounts is that Joseph was Jesus' adoptive father. So in his article, Lincoln offers another way. He posits that knowing the genre of the Gospels helps make sense of this apparent contradiction. As this subset of ancient Greco-Roman biography, the Gospels can be compared to other Greco-Roman biographies, such as Plutarch's biographies of Theseus, Romulus, and Alexander the Great. And in these examples, the central character is given two conception stories, one natural and the other supernatural. So, dual conception stories for the same figure wasn't uncommon in Greco-Roman biographies, which is the timing and the context of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And it suggested this was the way of assigning significance and worth to those who were perceived to have achieved greatness in their later lives. And in this genre, those who accomplished great things in their adult lives deserved an equally great, even supernatural conception story. Now, before I step on anybody's faith sensibilities, your spiritual sensibilities, do you believe Jesus was conceived by Joseph and become the Son of God, appropriating that supernatural quality, or was he totally conceived by God? God supplied the sperm, or God supplied the embryo, or God, so it's all God. God supplied the DNA, so to speak, which made up for the loss of the Y chromosome. So this is really interesting stuff, and Lincoln's approach is intriguing, and we're going to take a look at some of it in a minute here, but especially when applied to the nativity stories of Matthew and Luke. So we're going to take a look at that in a second, how babies were made in Jesus' time. And this all ties into the whole quest. We've kind of covered this and hit on and off on this in the recent weeks about the existence of Jesus. And did he exist? Remember the Jesus Seminar stuff we talked about, the stuff by Mack and all these other writers out there. Who are theologians, but who said, we think that there's a gap here somewhere. So, how were babies made in the time of Jesus? Kind of maybe a flippant question, meant to be a little tongue-in-cheek, but sexual intercourse, in order to conceive children, is such a basic human activity on the scientific level that we sometimes assume that all cultures have had more or less the same ideas about it as we have. So in reading accounts of procreation and conception in the Bible, it's often simply taken for granted that these people operated within a framework where, though the giving of life could be traced back to God, the human male and female participants must both have made their genetic contribution to any resulting offspring. So, back then, people have had to have known 2,000 years ago that if you have unprotected sex, which I don't think was even a term back then, how do you have protected sex when you didn't have prophylactics, when you didn't have birth control and things like that? So having sex could many times result in the birth of a child. People know that. There was that assumption that we have to operate by. And so once it's pointed out that our modern assumptions are just that, modern in the sense that they depend on a biological science that's only been available for a couple of centuries, and that ancient accounts of conceptions had their own literary conventions, interpreting biblical texts relevant to the conception of Jesus becomes interestingly much more complicated. At the same time, recognition of these differences sheds light on how ancients could think of the product of a virginal conception as being human, and how some would have had no difficulty combining an account of a virginal conception with a normal conception involving a human father. Now, keep in mind, there was this thing that in the Koine Greek, there was a word called the kenosis, and we've talked about this before, just briefly hit on it. That's the emptying of himself, is what it was supposed to be. Jesus came to earth. God conceived in Mary at the kenosis, the emptying of godhood of the DNA that's put inside her, although it doesn't state it that way. In Scripture, it uses the word kenosis. And so that Jesus, in essence, to be the Son of God, was supposed to be accepted as fully 100% human, while at the same time being fully 100% God. And so did this take place as so many other miracles we saw, that God used the natural and imbued it with supernatural? Or did God supernaturally have sex with Mary? And I don't mean that in a flippant way. I mean that in a descriptive way. Did he impregnate Mary supernaturally? Was there a visitation? I've heard some say this is like alien visitation and impregnation. We're not told those forms of the story, so we don't know. The most well-known view of Jesus' conception is recounted in the Annunciation stories of Matthew and Luke. Matthew 1, 18 through 25, and Luke 1, 26 through 38. And given subsequent prominence in the creeds and Christian tradition, is that Jesus was conceived without the participation of a human male. But matters were already more complicated because other New Testament writings assume that Jesus had two biological parents, that Joseph was his actual father, and that he was born of the seed of David, giving him the patrilineal descent from David. Now, they also say, however, that Mary was also descended from King David, that Joseph and Mary were like shoestring relatives that could get married. And what's interesting is that when they talk about Jesus being born of the seed of David, and they hail to Joseph as being the man who was the descendant of David, does that then mean that the New Testament is actually stating that Jesus had David's blood in him? And if he did through Joseph, then he was indeed the lineage of a human father. But what if he also had that blood of David given to him through Mary? That they were both people who were born of the seed of David. And so that's interesting when you think about that. So let me get back to this here, and let's go through this some more. Let's focus initially on what became the dominant tradition and agree with the scholarly consensus that Matthew and Luke contain accounts of a virginal conception. And get out of your mind, first of all, this idea that virgin was also used as a word to just mean young woman, not a young woman who hadn't had sex. So that's not what we're focusing on here. I want to focus on the idea of a virginal conception. So for many present-day readers, this poses an obvious problem. We know now, and we consider, that both parents' contributions to be necessary for human DNA, with, in the case of a male, the mother providing the X chromosome, the father the Y chromosome. Now, to be fully human male, Jesus would have needed Mary to supply the X and a human father to have provided the Y chromosome. Without this later genetic endowment, Jesus would have no real continuity with the human race. How then, we may ask, can the male product of a virginal conception be truly human? Now, I could bring everything to a screeching halt right there and say, it's obvious, dumbasses, you don't believe this story by faith. You're looking for any explanation you can other than a supernatural explanation or one of faith. That God, if he created human DNA, if he created male DNA, does he have the ability to create male human DNA in the womb of a woman without the participation of a human male that already existed? Could he create it out of nothingness? Yeah, but that's the faith story part of it. And so I get a little perturbed sometimes. I'm constantly hearing people trying to make the case by absolutely ignoring the faith story. Now, the faith story might not be true, might be false, might be made up. The faith story may also be true. The problem is, in this case with Jesus, we have no way of really knowing. So our difficulty doesn't occur this whole thing didn't occur to ancient writers and readers, because their understanding of conception, shaped by a patriarchal culture, would have been some variation of the domination of the Aristotelian theory. And on this view, the male semen provides the formative principle for life, and the female menstrual blood supplies the matter for the fetus, and the womb, the medium for the semen's nurture. The man's seed transmit his rationale, his rational cause, if you will, the pneuma, the vital heat and animating spirit, for which the woman's body is the receptacle. And in this way, the male functions as the active, efficient cause of reproduction, while the female functions as the provider of the matter to which the male seed gives definition. So in short, the bodily substance necessary for a human fetus comes from mom, while the life force originates from dad. And this would have been the ancient understanding under patriarchal context. So the larger understanding of sexuality, of which this is a part, prevailed until the 18th century, guys, the 1700s. And it's what Thomas Lacour has called a one-sex flesh model. One-sex/flesh model. And on this model, masculinity was at one end and femininity at the other, within a hierarchical spectrum. But where women's sexual organs were viewed as essentially the same as men's, but because of the woman's lack of vital heat, they had been retained inside the body. And so women were essentially men who lacked the anatomical perfection. Now, of course, we know by modern science that's not quite the way that works. So, next time you're having sex with somebody, remember, you're both just male. One's just got the internal organs and one's got the extra. BS, okay? That's the way we used to think. So on this understanding also, there was no clear distinction or a sharp boundary between the male and the female in regard to the fluids the bodies produced. Blood, semen, milk were each seen as interchangeable discharges. And all bodily fluids were basically forms of blood, their variety being determined by the heat of that blood. So, Aristotle thought that the menses might be viewed as a type of impure sperm. And the Hippocratic corpus and Galen held that women produced sperm. Did you know that? That's what they believed. You can see Peter Wilhelm von Dehurst's Did Sarah Have Seminal Emission? In the Bible, and this article surveys the evidence for the ancient view that females produced their own seed. But it was less refined than that of men. So with this continuum, this male heat, dryness and hardness were superior to female coldness and moistness and softness. Boom! There, we said all that stuff on live radio. How's that grab you? So, even though in general, women were seen as lacking the necessary heat of men, the one place in the human's body that was seen as hot was the woman's womb. I see a lot of parts of women's bodies that are hot. My wife is hot. But that's not what they're talking about. So both Aristotle and the Hippocratic corpus look upon the womb as the oven in which the bread is baked, the biscuit is baked. You know, the clams are cooked and boiled. And it does this in order to enable it to spark into life and shape the substance provided by the female. For Galen, if the offspring was female, then this was because it had been undercooked in the womb and had therefore not reached its full potential or its full heat. So women, you were undercooked, and that's why you became chicks. Chicks are hot, but they're undercooked. Now, according to Jewish scriptural writings of the time, it assumes the dominant biological understanding that the male seed is implanted in the womb and gives life to the blood. The substance is contributed by the mother. The contemporaneous Jewish philosopher Philo states, the material of the female is supplied to the son from what remains over of the eruption of blood, while the immediate maker and cause of the son is the male. So there you go. Now, later rabbinic traditions concerning embryology and procreation were deeply embedded within this Greco-Roman tradition, as were patristic views. So this ancient understanding continued to be held by Thomas Aquinas. The female supplies the matter while the male is the active principle of generation. So what becomes clear is that in terms of ancient biology, this is where we're going with this, folks. In terms of ancient biology and understanding of how the body works, how conception works, even without a human father, Jesus would have been seen as fully human. His mother, Mary, provided his human substance, and in this case, God, through the agency of the divine Spirit, supplied the animating principle instead of a human father. And so it was this understanding that enabled patristic writers in the 2nd century of the Common Era to respond to docetic and Gnostic views, which claimed that Jesus only appeared to be human. So patristic writers like Ignatius and Irenaeus saw clearly that Jesus, as the one who redeems humanity, must himself be in full solidarity with the human race. How could he be the kinsman redeemer if he was not fully human? And so in making that argument, they pointed to his being born of the Virgin Mary, since simply originating from a human mother was sufficient to guarantee his true humanity from the beginning of his earliest existence. And so this produces the irony that while on ancient views of biology, the virginal conception was thought to safeguard the humanity of Jesus, present-day biological understanding of such a conception undermines the notion of Jesus being fully human. We no longer think that a mother's genetic input alone is sufficient to produce a fully human male. For Jesus to be fully human, he would need to have had both a human father and a human mother. A Jesus without complete human DNA would now actually be the sort of docetic figure the patristic writers refused to accept in their day. A semi-divine or a wholly divine special creation that only appeared to be human on the outside. So combining this fully human Jesus with a virginal conception depends then for its coherence on ancient biological assumptions that we no longer share. To claim in response that all things are possible for a creator God who must have supplied the missing human chromosome, the missing human DNA, that it would have to be God contributing to Jesus' human substance, and thus no longer to hold to the same understanding of a virginal conception as that of Matthew and Luke, the patristic writers, and those who formulated the creeds. So while they held Jesus' humanity came from Mary and that God supplied the life principle in a non-physical fashion, this modern restatement of a virginal conception requires God to have acted in a biological way to provide part of the genetic material necessary for Jesus to actually be human. And we're just about out of time here, folks, but let me cram in a little bit of what I can. Maybe we'll pick this up tomorrow to finish it off. Now, I'm still only about halfway through my material here, because there's more to this. So, how did it become possible for some to entertain simultaneously the notions of a virgin conception without a father and a normal conception for the same person, as reflected in Jesus' descent from King David? And so in the case of Jesus, Jewish literary accounts of some conceptions in which the part of the male is missing prepared the way. So envisaging God's involvement in the human process of procreation. Job says, did he not who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb? The well-known psalm attributed to David proclaims, for it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. That's what it says in the book of Psalms. We tend to assume that this language was understood metaphorically and poetically. But the matter may not be that simple. And we'll find out more about this tomorrow because we got to quit for tonight. So you guys, thanks for being here. Thanks for putting up with me. Thanks for putting up with my politics. The political presentation in the first half. Thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoyed this. We're going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be right back. You sit tight.